Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us in this webinar entitled Human Rights, Structural Racism and the Totalizing Impact of Militarized Policing on Racialized Communities in Brazil. A new political era needs a new approach, which is organized by FLACSO Chile in partnership with the research group Human Rights, Education and Public Policies of Goiás State University in Brazil. My name is Matthias Erlandsen, and I am the chair of the Program of International Relations. And on behalf of FLACSO Chile, I'd like to welcome and introduce you to Dr. Siobhan Wills from Ulster University in the United Kingdom, Dr. Cathal McLaughlin from Queen's University Belfast, also in the United Kingdom, and Dr. Ulises Tertoneto from Goiás State University in Brazil, who will also act as chair of our panel today in this interesting and current topic for Latin America. And why not, maybe the rest of the world as well. Dr. Neto, the floor is totally yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Matt, for the invitation. Thank you, FLACSO, for the invitation. Thank you, Siobhan and Caru, for accepting the invitation to be part of the panel. Brazil has come from being a Portuguese colony to being a vibrant, through though imperfect, constitutional democracy. But human rights are still widely and regularly violated. This is because Brazil's structures are still deeply marked by social authoritarianism, which reflects a scenario of poverty, inequality, exclusion, and violence. More human rights progress is therefore dependent on deep-rooted structural changes, and human rights defenders have an important role to play. There is thus the need for a new project of sociability towards effective citizenship, which reflects the urgency for human rights defenders to lead the way towards socially constructing a human rights culture. The violence involving militarized policing affects mental health negatively. Comprehensive health is not possible without the realization of the right to mental health. Police violence directed to vulnerable communities has always been present in Brazilian society, but things have become worse since the parliamentary coup of 2016 and the corresponding increase of new fascist threats to Brazil's fragile democracy. The right to comprehensive health imposes 3 levels of obligations on the Brazilian state. Brazil has nonetheless been incapable of realizing its tripartite obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to mental health in the context of militarized policing. This is a serious problem that interests scholars, policymakers, human rights defenders, and specifically favela residents who have continually been victims of militarized policing in their own communities, as, for instance, Manguinhos, Alemão Complex, and Maré communities in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The film, As Long as I'm Alive, Resistance to Police Violence in Rio, addresses the issue of militarized policing and its negative effects on the mental health of favela residents in Brazil, and it is thus helpful for our discussions today. Let's watch the film, As Long as I Am Alive, Resistance to Police Violence, and after that, we're going to have a panel discussion.
Eu sou uma das fundadoras do movimento das Mães de Manguinhos. Sou a mãe do Jonathan. Jonathan, esse menino aqui, ó, da bandeira. O meu filho estaria completando 25 anos. Hoje, o Jonathan estaria completando 25 anos de idade se ele não tivesse sido assassinado com um tiro nas costas, disparado por um policial da Polícia Militar, lotado aqui em Manguinhos, na UPP de Manguinhos, em 2014. Desde então, minha vida tem sido lutar por justiça, por verdade, memória, não só do meu filho, mas de tantos outros filhos, né, dessa injustiça.
Quando meu filho foi alvejado pela polícia e eu consegui tirar ele da favela e socorri ele, levei ele para o hospital. Logo após ele foi encarcerado e foi sentenciado em 10 anos e 7 meses, acusado de um crime que ele não cometeu, pois aqui no Rio existe uma súmula que é a súmula 70, que basta a palavra de 2 policiais para encarcerar qualquer pessoa. Hoje ele está acautelado em casa com tornozeleira, mas para o Estado não basta criminalizar e encarcerar. O Estado quer provar para mim o tempo todo que nós só estamos vivos porque assim ele permite. Com isso, a minha luta hoje não é mais para provar a inocência do meu filho, e sim para garantir a vida dele, para que ele continue vivendo, já que o Estado, a qualquer momento, pode tirar a vida dele. Em todas as operações policiais em Manguinhos, o meu filho sofre abordagem policial, e o meu medo é que em alguma dessas abordagens eles decidam levar a vida dele.
So if you take the example of Brazil, where 4 people of African descent in places like Rio, the relationship with the militarized police is, it's unfathomable, I think, to many people who are living outside of those contexts, because of the priors that people bring. They imagine, again, a kind of one-to-one, you're living your life, and maybe you encounter a law enforcement officer who treats you in some type of way. But when you're in Rio, and if you're a person of African descent, and if you're in a favela, we're talking about basically living under military occupation, where you can have heavily armed, not where you can have, where you regularly have heavily armed police officials coming in and for hours, days, however long a period is, subjecting your community to levels of violence and what I would think of as extrajudicial killings, and just basically disrupting lives and holding individuals hostage in ways that I can't describe as anything other than totalizing, essentially. And where the kinds of human rights violations that we're talking about, yes, it's about the right to life, but it's about every single aspect of living as a free human being are completely stripped away in those moments.
Eu sou policial pericial, sou da perícia criminal, né? Polícia técnica ou polícia forense, como for melhor. Sou da Polícia Civil do Estado do Rio de Janeiro há mais de 4 anos, né? E até pela minha construção anterior da polícia, eu sempre fui uma pessoa muito crítica à política de segurança. Sempre me identifiquei com as pautas dos direitos humanos. E aí, quando eu entrei na polícia, eu vi uma carga muito grande de uma construção exatamente contrária. De que direitos humanos é para humanos direitos, né? Que direitos humanos é de vagabundo, é de bandido. Eu não entendi assim. E aí encontrei com um grupo de outros policiais que também não se entendiam assim, né? Esse grupo de policiais foi aumentando, foi encontrando policiais de outros estados, e aí a gente acabou construindo um movimento chamado Policiais Antifascismo, que é um movimento de policiais que entendem que a guerra é as drogas, né? Que o combate hoje à violência não é um combate à violência, mas um combate a uma parcela da população, no caso a população periférica, especialmente a negra.
I would like to often look at the issue of police brutality and policing methods as to why were the policing needed in the first place, right? Many countries have imported what people call the slavery time or the slavery era forms of policing, where slaves were having to be controlled and policed in terms of where they can go, where they can't go, but also it was about protecting, right, of white people's property. And so the racism and the racist methods of policing do have their roots there. And you can trace it throughout the world and how many countries have just imported that kind of policing methods. And no wonder people and citizens in general and communities who are marginalized, Black communities, communities of people of African descent, migrant communities, refugees, many of those communities feel that they are not free.
Né? Então a gente acredita que a polícia ela tem que ser civil, ela não tem que ser militar, até porque a lógica militar é a lógica de guerra, é a lógica do inimigo, é a lógica de entrar atirando, e aí você não entra atirando num lugar civil, então você não pode ter uma polícia que acredita que é normal entrar e tratar a própria população como se fosse uma inimiga de guerra.
Berçário 1, que são bebês aí de 7 meses até 1 ano e 3 meses, mais ou menos. E era foi uma fase aqui na comunidade que estava tendo muita operação. E, assim, era helicóptero, aquele barulho muito forte, né? Que eu acho que isso aí também traumatiza muito as crianças, inclusive os bebês, porque eles não entendem. Os tiroteios, a creche foi alvejada já, assim, graças a Deus ninguém foi atingido, mas a creche já foi alvejada por tiro. Exatamente nesse dia que teve essa operação, nós estávamos, era eu e mais 3 agentes educadores, nós estávamos no berçário com as crianças e começou aquele tiroteio, tivemos que descer todas, uma ajudando as outras, com 3 crianças no colo, descendo e subindo e ficando num corredor que assim não dava para adaptar todas as crianças da creche porque eram mais ou menos 400 crianças. Sim, todas elas ali enclausuradas naquele corredor. Eu acho que isso marcou muito a minha vida assim em relação ao que eu o que eu penso como violação. O que é violação? Violação é isso, é você tirar esse direito de uma criança, direito que ela está na escola, ela tá ali no direito dela e essas operações violentas vêm e, assim, não querem saber.
So these things, all of them are intersecting, whether it's police brutality, whether it's the policing methods, whether it's a continued harassment of children in the streets, just trying to get to school, just trying to get back from school home. That witnessing of violence every day not only just impacts you as a person who then has to live under the fear of violence, but it also impacts your ability to concentrate in class.
A gente tem crianças com depressão, né, que não frequentam diariamente as escolas. A gente tem escolas que foram invadidas pela polícia em momentos de aula por alguma questão e não tinha nada e essas crianças são impactadas diretamente. Mas a questão da saúde diretamente, a gente atende mulheres e crianças, casos gravíssimos de depressão, síndrome do pânico, por conta da violência geral. Tiroteio em momento que a criança está indo para a escola, tiroteio quando estão dentro de sala de aula, tiroteio no retorno para casa.
Essa violência, né, que atinge os nossos filhos e, consequentemente, atinge as nossas vidas, não é só a mãe que sofre, né? Não é só a mãe. Principalmente também os filhos que ficam, esses irmãos, né, que ficam. Porque além de perder o irmão amado, querido, os filhos que ficam perdem também a mãe, perdem um pouco da mãe, perdem o melhor da mãe, né? A alegria de viver, tudo isso. Toda uma família é atingida por essa violência, por essa dor, por essa perda.
By virtue of being a human rights lawyer, you place yourself in the category of the group who are there to solve the problem, right? Without thinking about the ways that even the human rights system itself is has been structured in a way that can exist side by side with the kind of violence that we are seeing, right? So I think thinking about the human rights tools that are typically used to address things like police violence, which often think about individual cases, burdens of proof in a criminal context. You know, they think about how you sue this police officer or when the challenges are truly systemic, right? They are about a world in which we've created societies that live below the standards of human rights, and where dismantling those structures isn't going to happen through suing one police department or kind of challenging individual procedural rights in the context of a particular shooting, right? So even when we're thinking about what the role of the human rights lawyer is, I think it is to follow the lead of the communities that are directly impacted. And following the lead means not just when it comes to documenting the harms, right? But understanding what it would mean to have human rights for communities that are directly impacted, that would be truly fulfilled. And those accounts can only come from the communities that are subject to the violence, which is totalizing in all of these ways.
It is important for all of us to really approach the issue in a very comprehensive manner, meaning that we need to have meaningful participation of people who these issues affect the most. We need to be intentional about who we see as an expert and not, because many people have a real lived experience and are still grappling, right, under the crushing weight of prejudice every day. And those people may not necessarily be seen as experts. And I think it's important that their voice also is on the table, in the room.
Eu sigo lutando com essas mães, que são as mães de Manguinhos. Fui acolhida por elas, me tornei uma mãe de Manguinhos. E quando a gente se torna mãe de Manguinhos, a gente deixa de ser só apenas mãe dos nossos filhos e passa a ser mãe da favela inteira.
To me, the value, the potential of a human rights framework, it can't be divorced from the capacity of that framework to really disrupt racial injustice, because racial injustice essentially preserves parallel spheres of lived experience. And that, I think, is what's truly terrifying about the situation in Brazil, is that you see groups who are living in conditions that for most people feel unfathomable, and are, because they're living in a different universe, even if they're occupying the same geographic space.
Eu tenho certeza que eu só continuo de pé porque se naquele primeiro momento em que eu recebi a notícia de que meu filho não tinha resistido e tinha falecido, se naquele primeiro momento a minha única vontade, o meu único sentimento era de morrer de junto com ele, a luta estar em contato com outras mães me fez ter forças e me fez entender que enquanto eu me manter viva, enquanto eu estiver viva, o Jonathan vai viver, o Jonathan vai estar vivo.
Now the panel is going to discuss on the film and its relation to state violence, militarized policing, and the mental health in Brazil. To do so, we have invited the directors of the film As Long As I'm Alive, Resistance to Police Violence, to whom I say thank you for accepting the invitation. Siobhan Wills, director of the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University, UK, and co-director of the film. Kahu McLaughlin, professor at the School of Arts, English and Languages, the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, and also co-director of the film. Let's start our discussions with Siobhan. Siobhan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me. Thank you to FLACSO for having us. Thank you to Matthias, to Ulysses, to Angela and Carla. It's a great pleasure to be here on this panel. And thank you all in the audience for watching the film. We've been working together in Brazil and working with Ulysses and with organizations in Rio, Mothers of Manguinhos, Redes de Mare, and a women's group from Alamar. And we've also been working more recently in the Amazon, in Maranhão, with the Federation of FETAIMA, the Federation of Rural Workers in Maranhão. And I say that because you may be wondering, what are these people from Northern Ireland doing talking about all this? But we've been working for some years, since about 2019, in Brazil on the issue of police violence. It's something that came out of my research on peacekeeper violence in Haiti. And so that's where we come from. And I think if you see the film, you will be struck by the level of totalizing impact of the violence of police on communities. And I think that's something that struck both of us very strongly when working with these communities, that it is well known, unfortunately, that the levels of police violence in Brazil are extreme. I think they're probably the highest in the world. The number of killings is astronomical. This is reported in papers frequently. It's also reported by human rights groups and human rights monitoring groups at Geneva and in the Inter-American Commission. This level of violence is talked about, but at least in the press and in most of the reports, it moves quite quickly from deaths. The focus, even though it's a human rights issue, is really on the criminal aspects, criminal law aspects, murders, assaults, rapes. Whereas being in those communities, of course, the extreme violence is unbearable, but it's much more than that. And I think that's something that we wanted to bring out, and that we would like to see raised and addressed more strongly within human rights groups and by lawyers who are representing communities that are impacted by police violence, because it's not just the individuals in the community that are impacted by police violence, it's the community itself. Police violence always occurs, I think, in Brazil. Maybe there are exceptions, but I've not heard of them. And I think in most places in the world, where it occurs is in communities that are also experiencing structural violence. It doesn't happen in well-to-do neighborhoods. The communities that are being subjected to killings, assaults, rapes by police are communities that are already experiencing structural violence. Tlaleng Mofokeng, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, describes structural violence as an often invisible form of violence, normalized through laws, policies, and the institutionalization of certain practices that have their roots in legacies of colonialism, racism, apartheid, and structural socioeconomic inequalities. And I think this combination of physical violence and structural violence is important to look at, to view them holistically as a totalizing impact on the whole community. And I think there are many different ways of looking at that, but I would like to look at the right to mental health and the right to the social determinants of mental health. Because the reason I want to look at that is because it's underexplored. It's not being addressed by lawyers or human rights groups at the level that I think it could be, and because the law is there, it's recognized. The Brazilian state also recognizes it, whereas other arguments for reforming the police or abolition of the police, whilst very strong, will take time. This law is already there and can be relied on and drawn upon by human rights monitoring groups, by lawyers, by the Brazilian state. Brazil's constitution, the Protocol of San Salvador, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Political Rights, all recognize that states are legally obliged to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to the highest attainable level of mental health to everyone within their jurisdiction. The wording may be different in different forms, but that is essentially what all of those pieces of law provide. And there is a clear consensus amongst human rights experts, amongst human rights monitoring bodies, and state representatives that the right to health encompasses the social determinants of health. The World Health Organization defines these as the conditions necessary for the realization of the highest attainable standard of health. And they include economic policies and systems, development agendas, social norms, social policies, and political systems. And in 2011, the signatories to the Rio Political Declaration on the Right to the Social Determinants of Health, which include Brazil, because the conference was held in Brazil, they committed to taking action on 3 overarching recommendations of the World Health Organization Commission on Social Determinants of Health: to improve daily living conditions, to tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources, and to measure and understand the problem and assess the impact of action. I'm not convinced that a great deal has been done to implement those commitments. Lawyers and human rights monitoring bodies rarely address states' obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to the social determinants of mental health in court cases. They may order counseling or support to a family who has experienced a killing or a violent assault, but I've never heard it or found it referenced in court cases. There may be some, but I haven't come across it, where they address it as a violation of the right to mental health, as an independent right, as separate from counseling and support to a killing or a manslaughter or a rape. I have not seen it addressed as a violation of an independent right that affects people more broadly than criminal law violations like killings. The people more broadly, as you will have seen in the film, that may be affected are children who are frightened by the things on the television about children being killed by the police, children who miss school or who experience trauma in school because of police operations, teachers. The whole community is affected. People can't get to work. People are frightened to leave their homes for what they might find when they come back again. So that kind of level of traumatizing of the whole community is something that I don't think is being addressed adequately in court cases, and it's not being addressed in monitoring reports either. Monitoring reports might reference the right to the social determinants of mental health, but they rarely go into detail about what those are and what this means for states. The former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, Danius Puris, though, was very strong. He said states must facilitate, provide, and promote conditions in which mental health and well-being can be realized. And he stressed that action that focuses only on strengthening failing mental health care systems and institutions is not compliant with the right to health. And he went on to say, for good mental health, for society, and for everyone, it is very important to be free from risk factors that damage mental health. And he specified that the key risk factors are violence, discrimination, inequality, which he sees as reflective of power imbalances that are at the root of compromised mental health. But there is little clarity on the nature and scope of states' obligations to protect the right to the social determinants of mental health, or what they might mean in practice, even though the risk factors are well known. Enjoyment of the right to the social determinants of the highest level of mental health is a foundational right, in my view. It's essential for the enjoyment of all other human rights. Obviously, life is essential. The right to life is essential for the enjoyment of all other human rights, but so is health, and so is mental health. If your mental health is compromised, then it's very difficult to fully enjoy any other kinds of human rights. For many racially marginalized communities, this right is severely compromised, in part to violent forms of social, political, and economic control. And the former UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Racism, Tendai Achiumi, she said, the human rights system itself has been structured in a way that can exist side by side with systems that leave racially marginalized communities living below the level of human rights that everybody else takes for granted. And I think that's a very strong indictment of our human rights system and something that we need to take on board. Research by Dr. Geronimus, who's professor of health at the University of Michigan, reports that living in marginalized communities that bear the brunt of racial, ethnic, religious, and class discrimination afflicts human bodies all the way down to the cellular level. She says that people are dying from the physical toll of constant stress. High and frequent levels of police violence against racially marginalized communities is a prime example of state conduct that has the potential to compromise mental health. There are others, but it's very clear that state violence, police violence, clearly has the potential to compromise mental health. Fiocruz, a leading world public health research institute, which is headquartered in Rio de Janeiro, their research reports that people living in the favelas, where the majority of the population is Black, are subjected to an extremely violent public security policy. And this is a core factor in the high levels of depression, anxiety, nervousness, and post-traumatic stress disorders such as nightmares, hypervigilance, flashback, emotional anesthesia. And Tanya Koller, who's a psychoanalyst at Brazil's National Observatory on Mental Health, Justice and Human Rights, she reports similar findings in the favelas. And she reports that the levels of psychological distress have reached almost epidemic characteristics. And she too links it very clearly to the policing policy, the violent policing policy. And psychologists in Brazil and outside of Brazil have posited that whilst death is the most severe health outcome of police violence, the mental health effects are likely to be more pervasive and potentially more impactful when you consider it across an entire community or population. There'll be many more people who will be affected by violations of their right to mental health than the individuals who were killed. I won't repeat what I've already just said. In 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, the Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 43.1 on the protection of people of African descent against excessive force and other human rights violations by law enforcement officers. And violations of the right to mental health as a result of excessive force by the police falls within this mandate. But to date, the UN's agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality, it's overall strong, but it's paid relatively little attention to the impact of police violence as a violation of the right to mental health. Little attention to looking at it as a violation of an independent right rather than a subsidiary consequence. So there seems to me to be a disjunction between the nature and scale of the human rights violations experienced by racially marginalized communities as a result of police violence, and the degree to which these are being addressed in the fora that represent victims, monitor compliance, and advocate for more effective implementation. And I think this needs to change. The right to the social determinants of mental health is a right that's already recognized, well established as a legal right, and is recognized as such by the Brazilian state. And there is also a clear consensus that police violence compromises mental health. And surely we can put the two together and insist that policing is conducted in a way that supports rather than violates the right to mental health. Within a community that is routinely subjected to police violence, it's not just those that are killed or injured or relatives of those who are killed or injured that are victims. Everyone within a community is a victim because an individual's mental health and well-being is closely connected with community health and well-being. And I think this is a new thought that's coming to me, but I think this possibility opens the door to considering the right to mental health as a community right as well as an individual right. And this might be particularly pertinent in Brazil because Brazil already recognizes some racially marginalized communities, for example, indigenous communities and quilombola communities, as having rights as a community, in and of itself as a community, and not just the members who make up the community. And so perhaps there might be a way to view the right to mental health as a community right as well as an individual right, a way of expanding this idea of community rights that some communities, racially marginalized communities in Brazil hold, to encompass the right to mental health. The right to mental health is already enshrined in Brazil's constitution and international human rights law. It is widely agreed, including by the Brazilian state, that this right includes the right to the social determinants of mental health. It's just a question of implementation. Policing is one area where the evidence is clear. Brazil's security policies are a major risk factor for compromised mental health of people in racially marginalized communities. And that is something that I think human rights monitoring bodies, human rights organizations, lawyers representing communities should take up. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, for your thoughts and lots of questions later on, I'm sure. Kahu, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Glasgow, and everyone, Ulysses, Matthias, Angela, for the invitation, and thank you to the audience for watching the film. And the film will be available afterwards. The stayswithyou.com website, which has a number of other complementary interviews, films, information, etc. And there was something Siobhan touched on, which I thought was probably worth maybe addressing briefly. Why us? Why white Northern academics working with marginalized Black communities in Haiti, in Brazil? And I think it's one of those almost fortuitous journeys that we've taken because we're from Northern Ireland, we're from Ireland, but also we're part of the United Kingdom, and we had our own political conflict lasting 30 years. And I think our interest in conflict and in post-conflict discussions, debates, responsibilities have kind of informed what we've ended up doing. We worked here, we worked in South Africa, and as Siobhan said, in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and we're stretching it from the state to the international state bodies like the United Nations. And it kind of goes from one situation to another, one leads to another. And what is really important for us as academic activists, filmmakers, law experts, is that when we work with people, we address that power differential that exists between us and the people we work with. And I think that's really important. Because there are, in terms of resources, in terms of funding, in terms of networks, even language, English language is one of the most, probably, if not because of the internet, the most common language in the world. We carry many, many advantages. And so the methodology of participatory practices is something we're very keen to ensure that we follow as closely as possible the best practices within participatory practices, which is basically about sharing power, about trying to create joint agency in everything that we do. And of course, there's a spectrum of participatory practices depending on the resources a community already has. So when we worked here in the north of Ireland, most people we work with are not too dissimilar from us. But when we worked in Bois-Neuf in Port-au-Prince, the poverty was probably the most extreme we have faced. It was daily. The idea of planning anything beyond a day was almost impossible. So you have to take the conditions of the situation into consideration when you're trying to implement participatory practice, and we try and push it as far as possible. One of the main reasons for that is that we're working with communities who have been traumatized. These communities, these individuals and the communities that Siobhan has referred to have themselves been traumatized individually but community-wide. So you're dealing with people who have come through violence, but often ripples of violence continue. And I think this is an interesting point about that refers directly to mental health, is that some of the people we speak to feel a double, even triple violation. There is the loss of their home, there is the loss of their daughter, the loss of their wage earner, etc. But then there are ripples. And in some of the examples that has been given is that a mother of children whose husband was killed, who brought in money to their family in Port-au-Prince, said that she'd been to the United Nations offices to try and get some acknowledgement, some investigation, some response. And every time they pushed back and said, come back later. And she gave up in the end. And she said, it makes you feel worthless. This is after already losing her husband. And that double kind of traumatization is also exemplified by Ana Paula in Rio de Janeiro, who said not only has her son and daughter lost a brother, but to some extent they've lost a mother, because she has become active, involved, trying to seek justice. And I think when you're working with communities that have been traumatized at different levels over a period of time, you risk re-traumatizing people as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, as a journalist, as an academic researcher. You're going back in again, and they're having to relive and retell, and that can be very difficult. And it was Renis Papadopoulos, who's a psychoanalyst who works in London, and he wrote about his experience of the Bosnian concentration camp survivors. And he said one of the things he learned almost immediately was to throw out the rule book. Because when people have been traumatized, their sense of self, their narrative of themselves has been fragmented. And what he asked them to do was to start telling the story of what happened. Just simply tell the story of what happened, to try and put those pieces together again. And I think for us, participatory practice is about allowing the participants to have agency in doing that and going through that process. What it means in reality is that because we bring the cameras, we bring the interpreters, we bring the transport, we bring all of that, how do we share authorship? And one of the most important ways of sharing it is to say to them that is to have the prior discussion before the film starts, to talk about what people want. What do they want out of the film? What do they want the film to achieve? Their story to contribute to. And it can vary. Some people will want simply to tell their story and just have public acknowledgement. One of the survivors said to us, "You're the first person who came to us in 10 years. I think it was Edrin said that. For 10 years we have suffered and no one has come near us. You're the first. And I'm glad. It's the first time in 10 years to tell the story. So that sense of having that opportunity, I think, is probably one of the most important. But also some people may not want to take part or may want something else, and managing expectations is really important. one of the communities we met with, some people who had survived state violence said, we want justice, we want you to bring us justice. And we had to negotiate and explain that was not our expertise. It wasn't within our power. We didn't want to promise something we couldn't deliver. And so these negotiations prior to filming is important. And then discussing who the audience will be. Where will this film go? Where do you want this film to go? And it depends. Some people want their own community to hear their story. Some people want the national government to hear it. And some people want the United Nations to hear it. So you're negotiating all the time. So everyone agrees at every stage. And during the filmmaking process, we will ask questions. But if anyone doesn't want to answer a question, that is edited out. If someone afterwards says something that maybe they start to regret, they can also take that out. So depending on the resources a community has, they will see drafts of the edit and post-production, but ultimately everyone who's in the film will see the film before it's ever made public. And they will have the right to withdraw, suggest amendments, different edits. So that's really important that people feel this is their story, they co-own the story, they're co-authors of the story. And that for us is important because you're working in very difficult, painful situations. Why filmmaking? Why storytelling? It's well known. I mentioned Papadopoulos. We've come out of a 30-year political conflict here, and there have been 3 official reports into how one might address a conflicted past in a continuing contested present. And to be quite honest, nothing has happened over the last 20, 23 years, 25 years. Very little has happened, apart from the ending of violence. But the difference is the conflict has moved on to another platform. And one of the most difficult is how do we tell the story of the past? And I think that shows its significance and its importance. But the 3 official reports that have not been acted on have all recommended storytelling or oral history as one way of helping to address the past. It doesn't replace justice panels, truth recovery, any of those other processes. It is complementary to it. And our experience is that by giving people the opportunity to tell their story, you're beginning a healing process at a community level, not just at an individual level, but at, as Siobhan said, at a community level. And we've shown films throughout the different countries, different situations that we've worked in. Probably the most important responses come from people outside of that community when they begin to empathize, when they begin to understand what it might have been like to be someone else. I think it's Michael Jackson puts it, to be in someone else, what it's like to feel to be in someone else's shoes, in someone else's position. And that's one of the benefits of filmmaking, of storytelling. And what film audiovisual does is it allows the participant in some ways to perform their memory. And in that film, you see Ana Paula and her other mothers of Manguinhos. They are erecting a banner and they're pointing to the children, their children, who were killed by the Brazil police. And Ana Paula has to stop because she points to her child, Jonathan, and it's his birthday. It's his 25th birthday, but he's no longer with her. And she has to pause and recollect herself. So in a sense, she is performing her loss, her memory, and that's very, very powerful for her. And she has appeared in several of our post-screening meetings and discussions and panel Q&As at Geneva and in Brazil. And that moment, I think, is really triggering for audiences as well. And I think that's really important when you're listening to someone else's story of trauma, is that it's important that you try and be there, be in their shoes, as it were. And I think when someone performs a memory audiovisually, it's easier for an audience, rather than a textual or a history testimony or a journalist report, to imagine being there, to imagine what it must be like to be, even in a small way, Ana Paula. And so I think for us as filmmakers, we try and facilitate that. That's where we put our energies, our expertise, and we do it because we have our own vested interests. We have some, we've been through some of these situations, nowhere near as extreme, but our neighbours, our friends here in the north of Ireland have experienced that. And so to some extent we have an understanding, and it's a skill we have. And so sharing that skill has become really important. But maybe if I could kind of end up by balancing the achievements with the limitations. I think it's really important that there are limits to what storytelling, filmmaking, and we can do. Our resources are relatively minor compared to a Hollywood studio, compared to a very large research fund at a university. We can get our film out into film festivals. We can get them on screenings at community groups, to academic communities, to the United Nations and Geneva. In many ways, if we had twice as big a budget, we would put as much money into the distribution as we would into the making of the film to have real strong impact. Other limitations, I think, are that, I think Siobhan has mentioned this before, sometimes our expectations get lifted. We took a film about Haiti to the United Nations, and the initial response was quite optimistic, that there was possibility of an investigation, an independent investigation into the peacekeeping troops' violations during the peacekeeping mission there, led by the Brazilian military. But within several months, the doors that had been opened for us and the participants in the film started to close. And so I mentioned Veronique going and knocking on the UN door and then being pushed back and told, ultimately, go away, and she felt worthless. There was a risk that that film raised expectations of the participants and us, because that door did open at headquarters in New York with the United Nations, but it then began to close again. And no matter how many emails Siobhan sent, eventually there was no response. So there are limitations to the work that we're doing, and that's important to balance. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Cahu, for your thoughts. Perhaps it's a good idea for us now to have some questions and answers. I'm going to present you with the first one. As you know, there has been a shift in power in Brazil, and Lula is back. And in light of that, based on the title of the panel we are having today, a new political era needs a new political approach. So how, in your opinion, what can be done differently by the Lula government in order to tackle efficiently, effectively, the issue of militarized policing and its negative effects on the mental health of marginalized communities, such as the favelas in Rio and other big cities in Brazil? First you, Siobhan, then Cahu.
Okay, all right. Well, I think, I guess it relates to what I was saying earlier. I think police violence affects the whole community. And I think in addressing that, the new government should, and I think it probably is trying to work with communities, but I think that's the core. It's the people who are affected who need to be engaged with to discuss what needs to change. And I think that's the first step. And I think it's important to view the impact of policing as an impact on a whole community, and it's invariably a racially marginalized community. So I think you need to look at structural violence, that the structural violence racially marginalized communities experience, and not separate it from the violence of policing, because they're closely linked. So to look at the issue holistically, to engage with communities that are affected. And I think there is a possibility there of making communities, the state rather, consider policing in a different way, if they are made aware of their obligations of the right to the social determinants of mental health, because they have a legal obligation there. And there's a contradiction between the Brazilian state signing up to commitments to enhance and work for the social determinants of mental health in 2011 at the conference held in Rio, and not implementing it in their own policies when there's clear levels. I mean, there's clear evidence of the harm that the potential harm that police violence can do. So I think it's primarily to engage with communities, to view policing as the way it's implemented in Brazil as a racist form of control. It's not being done for the benefit of community. So policing should be done in collaboration with, to the extent that you need policing, with the communities that are being policed. I recognize there are challenges there, that there is a new president, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole government has suddenly been transformed into a different government. So there are challenges that there, but I think that is something that the new government should work towards.
In a previous film, Right Now I Want to Scream, which is on the website, it stayswithyou.com. We interviewed a police officer called Janina, and Janina talked about police training. And she said police training now is much more like military training. It's almost as if the police are trained not in terms of respecting human rights, but in terms of suppression, using violence to suppress, repress. And she would like to see more, and I think this would be really important in a new policy, is to rethink police training so that right at the centre was human rights. And if you bring in mental health, this is a really interesting aspect, not just the effect on the community of mental health, but Leonardo in that film from Fiocruz talks about the impact on the violence perpetrated by the police on the police officers. There's a very high rate of sick leave, stress, and even suicide amongst police officers who become involved in perpetrating violence. So I think police training seriously needs to be looked at structurally, but also in terms of their purpose, but also the core training of, is it human rights or is it suppression?
As you mentioned, the solution, it's not up to the state. I mean, the communities, especially the marginalized communities, should be involved. In light of this, how important is the work of human rights defenders in resisting police violence in marginalized communities in Brazil? As, for instance, the work of mothers of Manguinhos in Rio de Janeiro. First Siobhan, then Caru.
I think this is central. It's the human rights defenders from communities. We're talking about policing, so human rights defenders that are experiencing state violence in the form of police-perpetrated violence, or even in the form of violence by private actors that police ignore, which is what happens to communities in the Amazon, in Colombo communities. It is those communities who are experiencing the violence, who know best the harms that it is causing, and who know best what they want done about it. And so I think it is fundamental that we support human rights defenders. And I would hope that all of our work, really, all human rights work, is at base in support of human rights defenders, because it is they, human rights defenders, who are experiencing human rights violations. And what is the point of human rights NGOs or communities or experts or human rights lawyers if they're not supporting the people that are being most impacted? So I think their views and their needs for support should be central. It is quite shocking, the level of killings and abuses against human rights defenders in Brazil is extreme. So I think this is something that it's not just the levels of police killings in Brazil that is extreme, but it's the human rights defenders, especially in the northeast Brazil, in the Amazon and Amazon Cerrado ecotone, that are experiencing extreme levels. So I think it is important that the government really takes on board its commitments to human rights defenders, and also that we in the human rights community also take that on board.
Yeah, I think with that definition of human rights defenders, from lawyers right through to parents who have lost their children as a direct result of state violence, I think that kind of range of human rights defenders are doing the most incredible, courageous work at the minute. In fact, in some ways, they're doing the work that the state itself should be doing. While the state arms of the state are perpetrating the violence, the state itself is paid through taxes to look after its citizens, and it's doing a very poor job both at state and federal level. And human rights defenders are stepping in to do that work that the state and the federal government should be doing to protect its citizens. And I think any support that we or anyone else can give human rights defenders is invaluable, is really important, both in terms of respecting the demands that they face. I mean, of course, there's financial resource requirements and needs from those individuals and communities, but there's also an understanding, and again, this comes back to the notion of mental health, how it impacts on human rights defenders. We often kind of forget that this isn't just a question of the resources needed. Maybe we need more lawyers, we need more of this, more of that. Those human rights defenders who are engaged in the work that they're doing undergo a lot of extreme stress. And it is extreme. The ones that we've met and we've come across, the exhaustion, the threats that they face are constant. And we know some in the Northeast who no longer goes to the beach because he feels threatened as a lawyer. And, you know, we know in some of the favelas, some of the communities are very, very concerned about their own health, the threatened violence against them. And again, this is from the state. This isn't the local drug gangs. It's often the state forces that they're most frightened of, and they move house. They leave for a period until they're told it's safe to come back. So I think that living with that stress must be exhausting, and I think in any way that society can support them, it should.
Just to come back on what I was saying, and also to support what you were saying, I think linking to the question you asked earlier about engaging with communities that we need to engage, it's what communities are. Communities should take the lead. I think that's also true with human rights defenders. I think there has been policies in the past where the idea is that organizations can come and protect individuals who are being threatened and maybe take them to a safe place, take them away, to protect them from these attacks. And the people that we met in Northeast Brazil, in the Kapor indigenous communities and in the Colombo communities, they didn't want that. They want protection that is within their community. So they want protection for their whole community rather than the individual having to be removed and protected by external people. Like it's almost a repeat of colonialism in a way, to take people who are being violated by the colonial system into a safe place, but not address the problems that are the community that is being impacted by it. So I think it's important really to engage with community on all levels, including how best to protect human rights defenders.
Yeah, I think I could come in again. Sorry, Ulysses. I think
go ahead.
that idea of foregrounding what the human rights defenders, what the communities, what their needs are, what their wants are, and that negotiation on a very small scale that we did as filmmakers needs to be done by other powers. So if you're coming up with a policy for the Quilombola community or the Kapor community or the favela community, then you need to have a negotiation and a discussion about what it is that they want and they need and their best interest. And that was a really good example, because the organisation that were taking them for safety on the surface sounds a wonderful proposal, because someone's threatened. They're being threatened by the local farmer who's already killed someone in that community. Take them to a place of safety. The problem is that leaves that community still vulnerable. And they have their own. One community, I think it was a Kapo community, said to us that they were trying to reclaim some land, and based on kind of gender prejudice, some of the women went first and established a community, and then the men joined them as a strategy, because they thought it would throw the farmer, who was much more patriarchal in his attitude about things. So I think local communities have got some really good innovative solutions.
Reasons.
Yeah, I'm listening to this very interesting topic. Me myself not being an expert on this field, but I have a few questions that came up to my mind, and I don't want to be the devil's advocate here, and because you spoke about the mental health issues on communities, right? And police officers are also part of those communities, of course. So now, how are they, the police officers in general, impact about this racialized policing? Is this maybe a vicious cycle?
How are the police impacted by the policing that they are enforcing?
Right. Because I'm pretty sure it's not normal for anybody to think that the police officers want to be that bad with the population or their communities. They want to be also part of their communities and protect and defend them. So there should be some impact on them as well, I suppose.
Yes. Not the short film we've just showed, but at least I don't think it's in this film. But Janaina, the police officer that we interviewed, she's a member of the anti-fascist police, and she was saying that the problem is that people come into the police force with normal expectations of policing and expect to do a good job, a human rights oriented job, but it's more or less squeezed out of them or beaten out of them, because there are certain expectations of what a good police officer is, what they should do, and what they should achieve. And what they should achieve is getting arrests, or not even arrests, but dealing with what there's a kind of a racialization of whole communities, and a criminalization that everybody in a community is a criminal. And therefore, or at least anybody in a community who happens to be in the way of a police officer is a criminal. And even if they're not, well, most people are criminals, and it's just collateral damage, which isn't appropriate in policing at all, but it's something that is drawn in from this warlike language that you're dealing a war on drugs, which is really a war on Black people in Brazil anyway. And that kind of, you come in with one idea about the job you're going to do, and in order to be part of the team, be recognized by other police officers, get promotion, you have to do something else. And I think that that must be very destructive to police officers' mental health. And that is recognized, that police officers are experiencing high levels of mental stress. And also because it's extremely violent, it's dangerous. They get injured too. So they're experiencing stress from the fear of going in with heavy weapons and maybe getting shot themselves. They're experiencing traumatic stress from witnessing injuries to people that may be quite horrible. Children are killed, and that they may be responsible for, or at least they and their colleagues are responsible for. And people, that is inevitably very distressing. And so I think it's a question of looking at, you have to, there are strong arguments for the abolition of policing, but I think they take time. In between, there are arguments for requiring the state to revise its security policies in line with human rights standards, which should include the right to mental health. Now, And this is something that, because there is a new government, we have Lula, we could do. The previous government, Bolsonaro, General Heleno, in his campaigning for Bolsonaro in, I think it was 2018, he was doing lots of TV interviews, and he was arguing for adopting the policies he had used. He was the general in Haiti. He was arguing, he led some very brutal operations in Haiti, but he was arguing for basically a war on people on people in favelas. And he certainly wasn't very subtle about distinguishing between drug criminals and everybody else in favelas. And that attitude to fighting, to dealing with insecurity, with drugs, and all these lawlessness by treating it as a war was something that Bolsonaro's government supported and enhanced. And there he was with helicopters and firing into civilian communities, residential areas. That is something that quite clearly Lula can stop. We don't have to do that anymore. And in doing so, build the government collectively with Lula can build a new policy that that is a human rights oriented policy. So that is something that the government can do, and that will be a benefit to the police as well as to the communities that are affected.
One of the things that the communities favelas was telling us is that they had noticed over a period of decades that the role of the police had changed from being community police, having a presence in the community, to having their barracks, their offices outside of favelas. And that meant that when they went into favelas, they went in not really knowing the territory, not knowing the people, armed to the teeth. They were immediately the other, they were the enemy, and they saw the community as the other, as the enemy, the entire community. So I think that move away from, it was never perfect, even under Lula, there was limited community policing, but there was even less over the last 10 years as stations, barracks moved out of favelas, and that lack of engagement between the population and the police exacerbated under Bolsonaro. And I think a government needs to address that again.
And you mentioned that this is a problem with racialized communities, but I wonder if it's only about those communities, it's also about problems with, let's say, indigenous people, women in general, girls in general, and it also affects for example, the LGBTQ community, or when more of one of those, let's say, tags apply to one person. Let's say a black gay person could be double racialized or double having more problems with policing rather than a white straight man, right?
Yes, I think you're right. When I was referring to racially marginalized communities, not just black racially marginalized communities, I would include indigenous communities as racially marginalized. And I think, yes, within those communities, there are people who are more vulnerable than others, and that would include LGBTQI and women and children. I think they have greater vulnerability because the structures of the society that we live in, on top of the colonialism and racialism, is patriarchy. And I think all of that intersection means that the people who are at the bottom of the pile, or the most squeezed out by patriarchy, are also squeezed out and experience the most pressures within a community that is exceptionally pressured, which would be racially marginalized communities. I imagine somewhere in the world there is police violence against communities that are not racially marginalized, but I think in Brazil it's not the white communities. It's not, basically.
Right.
I think I would support what Siobhan said there in terms of the communities, but even within the police force itself. And this was something, again, that we discovered, as well as the anti-fascist network within the police service. There is also an LGBT plus network within the police service, and that is both about how the police treat the LGBT plus community, but also what it must be like for an LGBT plus person to be a police officer. So I think those networks need to be encouraged and supported and resourced.
If I may add, I'm doing a research right now with human rights defenders, and there is a question that asks if the fact that you are, in addition to being a human rights defender, you are a woman, a gay, a black, an indigenous, if this would increase the risk of, the activities you do. The evidence has shown that it does. It can give you privileged information about the research. So I've interviewed about 30 so far, and all of them, they have said the same. The fact that you are black, the fact that you are gay or lesbian, the fact or trans for that matter, the fact that you are indigenous, you become even more targeted by the police sometimes. So it's a fact. At least the evidence has shown. I can give you a scientific answer based on the interviews with human rights defenders. At least I'm not talking generally the community as a whole, but people who are fighting for rights in the communities, in marginalized communities. The fact that they have, in addition to being human rights defenders, like the sexual orientation issue, the racial issue, and so on, it's an element of increase of violence against them.
And I have one more final question for any one of three of you guys, because this is a very interesting topic and little, research in Latin America. But I would like to know if there's any other previous research anywhere in the world that has addressed the same problem, and how those places have dealt with racialized or marginalized violence against communities. Because I understand, for example, Chauvin spoke about a previous experience in South Africa that maybe it's a little bit interesting to share. And I understand that the Nordic countries at some point have dealt with the same issue during the history. So how have they managed and addressed this issue?
Can I start?
Yeah.
Maybe if I start with here in the north of Ireland, after the conflict, during the 30 years of conflict that ended about the year 2000, there was very little support for mental health for victims of traumatic events. But post that, more resources have been put in, and not only the National Health Service, which is funded a public body, has much more resources in terms of supporting people who have been affected. And it is intergenerational. A lot of research, a colleague of Siobhan has done a lot of research into intergenerational trauma, but also independent bodies such as a Wave Trauma Centre have received lots of support and funding and are open and are free. The service is free and specifically deal with people who have been affected either directly or indirectly by political violence. And I think recently we've gone through quite a period of austerity, partly, not solely because we have no government in Northern Ireland. The unionist major party is refusing to share power with a nationalist party at the moment because it suddenly replaced it as the main one. There's been lots of cuts, education, health sector, etc., etc. One area that has not been reduced in funding because of the sensitivity of it is support for mental health directly related to the political conflict. And that's, in some ways, that's one little glimmer of light.
Yeah, indulge me on this because it's a very important topic. Siobhan has mentioned, she has just come up with a new idea. It's about the community, the right to mental health as a community right. And I think that's crucial for an issue that we are facing here in Brazil, which is how to protect the collective. We have some experience on protecting the individual, like the leadership. But how can we protect the whole community, like the whole favela, the whole tribe, the whole, quilombo, and so on? So that's a very tricky question. perhaps under the legal aspect of it, to have this category, if I may. It's interesting. So that's my question. My question to Siobhan: what can be done to develop, to advance this concept of mental health as a collective right? And to Kahu, how can art help in bringing awareness towards this new concept?
I'll be quite tentative about answering that. How can we bring to a fruition a recognition and implementation of the right to mental health as a collective right? Because it's a fairly new thought to me to be thinking about it. But I think, although it's a new thought, it's also a common sense. Mental health, I mean, psychologists and psychiatrists are unquestionable that our mental health is closely linked to our community relationships, to our upbringing, to the whole network, to our whole experiences within community. You can't have good mental health. We're not just born into the world with good mental health and we live in a bubble. It is community related. It just is. And that is so well understood within psychology and psychiatry that it's indisputable. So it's also recognized that we all as individuals have a right to mental health and to a the highest attainable standard of mental health, or a high level of mental health. And since you can't have that unless you're in a community that supports your mental health, then I think it's arguable, but it's up to us as within the human rights community and as lawyers to promote and advance that argument that in order for people to enjoy good mental health, then we have to ensure that the community, everybody within the community has good mental health. And since communities, I think it's true for all communities, but I think one way of starting looking at it is those communities that actually do have that actually do have community rights, such as Indigenous and Colombo communities, because they are recognized as having a separate culture and lifestyle and from the mainstream. And that culture and lifestyle is essential to their mental health, of course. So you could argue that those communities should be able to think about mental health, not just as for the individuals within that community, but thinking about maintaining the community way of life that they believe in and that is their heritage as something that is linked also to their mental health. And if you can do that for a Colombo community or an Indigenous community, why can't you do it for a favela and other communities? And recognize that family communities recognize it as a collective right. It's a lot of steps, but I think the components are there. So it's a question of advancing it.
I think art therapy is quite a common discipline and methodology for addressing trauma, to give people the opportunity to use art directly. And in some ways, film is also people contributing to an art form, a story, a film-making process, where they're involved from the very beginning to the very end. And a number of people, have said to us afterwards, these films that we've made in the favelas in Haiti, that the making of the film has greatly contributed to their sense of self. And there was one man, Jean-Pierre, in Boisneuf in Port-au-Prince. And Jean-Pierre, we went back the day after we had filmed him. He talked about his house, and he was filmed in the debris of his house. They used tanks, effectively, and the entire house was demolished. And we have footage of the area where huge destruction from helicopters in this very, very vulnerable community. And he gave us his testimony as to what had happened. And we went back to film someone else the next day, and we met Jean-Pierre, and he said hello, and he thanked us very much. And he said, I I feel as if I have grown 1 foot taller since I gave that interview. I don't know if I am 1 foot taller, but I feel as if I am 1 foot taller. And I think that sense of attention, engagement, being listened to, public acknowledgement as an art form is really important. And, you know, we've witnessed other ones in South Africa. The Human Rights Media Centre had a project where body art was done, where someone lay down in the ground, someone else traced their entire body, and then the person drew their representation of either a physical or an emotional pain somewhere in the body. And they exhibited it. That travelled around South Africa, it travelled over to the United Kingdom, it went to the United States. So that form of art was really helpful for those people who had been tortured, who had lost someone during the apartheid years, etc. And I know that when I worked with the Wave Trauma Centre I mentioned earlier, the cutaways to the testimony was her making a kind of cutting out magazines of cars and putting them all together is a kind of a collage, because her son, who had been killed in a sectarian killing, and he was only in his 20s, at weekends, he invited his mother to go to car scrapyards because his hobby was making cars from nothing, from buying bits and pieces and making cars. And so she memorialized him with this lovely little art piece from simple colour Sunday magazine cutouts. It was a lovely moment where she talked about, as she was doing it, she talked about why she was doing it. And that's, I think art can play a role like that.
Well, thank you. As Matt has mentioned, I'm afraid we are running out of time. So before I pass the floor to Matt for the final considerations, allow me just to thank you all, Siobhan, Kahu, Angela, and Carla, and of course Matt for organizing the event, participating in it. Also FLACSO Chile and the research group Human Rights Education and Public Policies of Goiás State University, Brazil. And now I pass the floor to Matthias for the final considerations. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Will, Dr. McLaughlin, and Dr. Tortoneto. It's been a pleasure to host you today in this interesting panel on human rights, racism, and policing. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today, and feel welcome to check FLACSO's social media channels in Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And please don't forget to follow the podcast Mirada Latinoamericana, available on Spotify. See you next time.